It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
Julianna Vance laughed as she poured the wine over Cassandra Vance's dress in front of the entire gala. The vintage Bordeaux was a dark, visceral crimson, blooming across Cassandra's off-the-rack beige blazer like a fresh wound. The room, filled with the city's elite, went deathly silent. The only sound was the rhythmic drip-drip-drip of the expensive liquid hitting the polished marble floor. Julianna didn't look remorseful. She stood there, draped in custom-tailored emerald silk that cost more than Cassandra's annual rent, her eyes glittering with a predatory sort of glee. She adjusted her vintage Rolex, the one with the rare sapphire face, and tilted her head. "Oh, Cassie," Julianna said, her voice carrying perfectly across the ballroom. "I am so sorry, I didn't see you there. You just have a way of blending into the shadows, don't you? It's that. What do you call it? Peasant aesthetic." A few of the influencers in Julianna's inner circle snickered. They held their champagne flutes like scepters, looking down at Cassandra with a mixture of pity and disgust. Cassandra didn't move. She felt the cold, sticky weight of the wine soaking through her shirt, the oaky, fermented scent of the alcohol filling her lungs. She didn't cry. She didn't even flinch. Instead, she looked down at her Casio watch. 8:15. The reception was exactly on schedule. "It's fine, Julianna," Cassandra said, her voice low and remarkably steady. "Is it?" Arthur Vance stepped forward, the patriarch of the family looking every bit the elder statesman in his bespoke tuxedo. He didn't look at the mess on his eldest daughter's clothes. He looked at the stain on his reputation. "Cassandra, for heaven's sake, go to the kitchen and have one of the staff help you. You're making a scene." "I'm making a scene," Cassandra asked quietly. "You're standing there dripping on the floor," Arthur snapped, his face reddening. "Julianna made a mistake. Don't be dramatic. Go." Cassandra glanced past her father to the man standing just behind him. Marcus Thorne, the tech billionaire everyone was here to impress, was watching the exchange with an expression of clinical detachment. His eyes drifted from Julianna's triumphant smirk to the Casio on Cassandra's wrist, then finally to the wine stain. He didn't say a word, but his silence felt like a gavel. Julianna reached into her designer clutch and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. She tucked it into the pocket of Cassandra's ruined blazer with a wink. "Here, go buy yourself something that doesn't come from a clearance rack. Consider it a tip for staying out of the photos tonight." The humiliation was surgical, proportional. Julianna wanted to remind the world that while they shared a last name, they didn't share a status. She wanted everyone to see the sleeping lion as nothing more than a stray cat. Cassandra felt the heat of the room rising, the smell of expensive lilies and heavy perfumes suddenly cloying. She looked at the $100 bill, then at her sister's sapphire Rolex. As a high-level forensic auditor, Cassandra was trained to see what others missed. She didn't see a beautiful watch. She saw asset tag 402B from the Vance Holdings liquidation report, an item that had been marked as lost during the firm's recent bankruptcy filing. Julianna was wearing evidence of a felony like it was a fashion statement. "Thank you, Julianna," Cassandra said, her voice taking on a chillingly professional edge. "I'll make sure this goes exactly where it belongs." She turned and walked away, the wet fabric of her trousers making a faint, heavy sound against her legs. She didn't head for the kitchen. She headed for the coat check. Behind her, the party resumed. She heard Julianna's high-pitched, melodic laugh ringing out, followed by Arthur's booming voice as he regaled Marcus Thorne with stories of the family's supposed grand legacy. They thought she was retreating. They thought the quiet daughter had finally been broken. At the coat check, Cassandra retrieved her modest trench coat and a battered leather briefcase. She stepped out onto the balcony, the cool night air hitting her face and clearing the scent of wine from her senses. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number she had memorized weeks ago. "Detective Miller," a voice answered on the second ring. "It's Cassandra Vance," she said, watching her reflection in the glass doors. The wine stain was dark, almost black in the moonlight. "I'm at the estate. The gala is in full swing." "Do you have what we discussed?" Miller asked. Cassandra looked back through the glass. She saw Julianna gesturing wildly with her champagne glass, the sapphire Rolex catching the light. She saw her father leaning in close to Marcus, promising returns on investments that Cassandra knew didn't exist. She saw a house built on forgeries, debt, and the arrogant belief that people like her were too small to matter. "I have more than that," Cassandra said, her fingers tightening on the briefcase. "I just saw the missing sapphire Rolex. Julianna is wearing it, and my father just handed Marcus Thorne a prospectus for the offshore accounts, the ones we tracked last Tuesday." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "If you do this, Cassandra, there's no going back. They're your family." Cassandra looked at her Casio watch, 8:25. "They stopped being my family the moment they started stealing from the pension funds of people who actually work for a living," Cassandra replied. Her voice didn't tremble. "The audit is complete. I'm sending the encrypted files now." She hit send on her phone. A progress bar appeared, flickering in the dark. "How long?" she asked. "The warrants are signed," Miller said. "We'll be there in 48 hours. The board meeting on Thursday morning." "Good," Cassandra whispered. "I want them to have 2 more days of thinking they've won. I want them to feel exactly as high as they can possibly get." She hung up and looked back at the ballroom. Julianna was center stage, the golden child, the influencer, the success. She had no idea that the floor beneath her designer heels was already beginning to vanish. Cassandra tucked the $100 bill into her briefcase, right next to the ledger that would dismantle her father's empire. She would wear the wine-stained blazer for a little while longer. It was a small price to pay for the look that would be on Julianna's face when the handcuffs clicked shut. 2 days. The countdown had officially begun. The following morning, the sun hit the Vance estate's breakfast room with a brightness that felt almost offensive. The air was thick with the scent of Julianna's signature perfume, a cloying, heavy jasmine that cost more than a forensic auditor's monthly salary. Cassandra Vance sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, her simple Casio watch looking like a dull blemish against the pristine white linen and the silver service sets. Julianna Vance didn't look up from her phone as she reached for her crystal glass of mimosa. Her wrist was heavy with a gold Rolex, the diamonds catching the morning light and throwing sharp, jagged reflections across the hand-painted wallpaper. "I've decided, Arthur," she said, her voice dripping with a casual authority that made the air in the room feel thin. "We're not just rebranding the foundation after the merger. We're purging the dead weight, starting with the charity positions we've been subsidizing for years." Arthur Vance, seated at the head of the table, offered a thin, indulgent smile. He didn't look at his eldest daughter. He never did when Julianna was in the room, performing for an audience of one. "A wise move, Julianna. Efficiency is the key to the Vance legacy. We cannot afford sentimentality in the current market." "Exactly," Julianna said, finally turning her gaze toward her sister. Her eyes were cold, scanning Cassandra's off-the-rack navy blazer with visible disgust. "You should probably start looking for a new apartment, Cassie. This house is for people who contribute to the brand, not for people who spend their days staring at spreadsheets in polyester. It's bad for the aesthetic." Cassandra took a slow sip of her coffee, the ceramic mug warm against her palms. She felt the familiar, sharp bite of the wine-stained blazer's memory from the night before, but she didn't flinch. "I'm quite comfortable where I am for now," she said, her voice level and devoid of the tremor Julianna clearly expected. "Comfortable," Julianna laughed, a sharp, metallic sound that grated against the quiet of the morning. She leaned forward, the smell of her expensive perfume intensifying until it was almost suffocating. "You're a parasite, Cassandra. You've been living off our name while dressing like a librarian at a clearance sale. Marcus and I are going to modernize this entire empire. There's no room for peasants in the new Vance era." Marcus Thorne entered the room then, his presence immediately shifting the power dynamic. He looked impeccably tailored in a charcoal suit, his eyes sharp as he took in the scene. He didn't join the laughter. Instead, he pulled out a chair next to Julianna, but his gaze flickered toward Cassandra for a fraction of a second too long, a silent calculation behind his eyes. "We were just discussing the board meeting tomorrow," Julianna told him, her hand moving to rest possessively on his arm, her manicured nails digging slightly into the expensive fabric of his sleeve. "Dad is making me the face of the new acquisition. It's going to be the biggest moment in Vance history. A total takeover." "It certainly will be," Cassandra murmured. She reached down and adjusted the strap of her Casio. The plastic felt cheap, a stark contrast to the heavy silver tray nearby, but the digital display was precise. 36 hours until the board meeting. She could feel the weight of the encrypted ledger she'd sent to Detective Miller, a digital guillotine waiting for the right moment to fall. "What was that?" Julianna snapped, her brow furrowing as she sensed the lack of fear in her sister's tone. "Did the peasant have something to say?" "Just that I'm looking forward to the meeting," Cassandra said, meeting her sister's gaze directly. "I wouldn't miss it for the world. I think the truth of the Vance legacy is finally going to come to light, all the hidden corners." Julianna rolled her eyes, turning back to Marcus with a dismissive wave of her hand. "She's so dramatic. It's the poverty, I think. It makes people bitter and delusional." She picked up a piece of artisanal toast, then dropped it back onto her plate with a sigh of boredom. "Arthur, tell the staff to pack up the attic. I want all of Cassandra's things moved to the garage by tonight. I need the space for my new wardrobe delivery for the gala." Arthur nodded, his silence a final, cold betrayal. "Of course, Julianna. It's time we cleared out the clutter." Cassandra stood up, her chair scraping softly against the marble floor. She didn't argue. She didn't beg for her space or her dignity. She simply walked toward the door, her hand brushing against the pocket where her phone sat silent, waiting for the final confirmation from Miller. "Where are you going?" Julianna called out, her voice echoing with the unearned entitlement of a queen. "I didn't dismiss you yet." Cassandra paused at the threshold, looking back over her shoulder. The sunlight caught the gold of Julianna's Rolex one last time, a glittering symbol of everything she was about to lose. "I have some final audits to finish," she said, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "You'd be surprised how much can change in 24 hours. She walked out before Julianna could respond, leaving the scent of jasmine and arrogance behind her. The countdown was no longer in days. It was in heartbeats, and Cassandra Vance was the only one who knew the rhythm. 2 days later, the sterile silence of a rented office in the city's industrial district felt like a sanctuary compared to the suffocating opulence of the Vance estate. The air here smelled of ozone and burnt espresso, a sharp, honest contrast to the cloying jasmine that Julianna favored. Cassandra sat at a scarred metal desk, the blue light from 3 oversized monitors reflecting off the scratched crystal of her Casio watch. The ticking was rhythmic, a tiny, mechanical heartbeat that felt more real than any promise her father had ever made. Detective Miller stood by the window, his silhouette framed by the gray afternoon sky. He didn't look like a man who spent his days chasing shadows, but the thick file he dropped onto the desk suggested otherwise. The heavy thud of paper against metal echoed in the small room. "You were right about the offshore movements," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "The signatures on the transfer of the Hampton property don't just look suspicious. They're digital fabrications. Your father didn't even use a high-resolution scan. He was arrogant enough to think no one would ever look at the metadata." She pulled the file toward her, her fingers steady. As a forensic auditor, she lived for the moment the numbers began to scream. She opened the folder, and there it was, the smoking gun in black and white. Arthur Vance had been systematically draining the family trust for 3 years, funneling the remains into a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. He wasn't just disinheriting her. He was stealing the very foundation of the legacy he claimed to protect. Her phone buzzed on the desk, the vibration rattling against the metal. A notification from a social media app popped up. Julianna was live streaming again. Cassandra tapped the screen, and the image of her sister filled the room. Julianna was standing in a high-end boutique, surrounded by shimmering silks and the attentive, terrified staff of a designer who charged 4 figures for a blouse. "It's just so hard to find the right shade of ivory for the gala," Julianna said, pouting at the camera while a stylist held up a gown that cost more than a mid-sized sedan. But then again, some people don't have to worry about that. My sister, for instance, is probably still trying to figure out if her plastic watch is water-resistant enough for the tears she'll be crying when she sees my entrance. Some people are just born with bargain bin souls, you know. You can't put Chanel on a peasant and expect her to understand the vintage. The comments section scrolled by in a blur of heart emojis and sycophantic praise. Cassandra watched for a moment, her expression unreadable. She felt the familiar sting of the peasant label, a word Julianna threw around like a weapon. But then she looked back at the monitors. She saw the trail of debt, the forged signatures, and the looming bankruptcy that Julianna was currently spending into existence. "She has no idea," Miller remarked, gesturing toward the phone. "She doesn't want to know," Cassandra replied, her voice cold and precise. "She thinks the world is a stage built specifically for her. She doesn't realize the floorboards are rotting." The office door creaked as Miller stepped closer, leaning over the desk to point at a specific line of code on the second monitor. "If you trigger the audit now, the freeze hits within the hour." "No," she said, her eyes fixed on a digital image of a deed. "The gala is tomorrow night. Marcus Thorne will be there, along with the entire board of directors. My father wants to announce Julianna as the sole beneficiary of the new trust. He wants to do it publicly to ensure Marcus feels secure in the merger." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, silver flash drive. It felt heavy in her palm, a concentrated weight of truth. This was her secret power, the culmination of 6 months of quiet, late-night data mining. It contained the original, uncorrupted files from her mother's estate, the ones Arthur thought he had deleted. "I need the final confirmation on the Thorne merger documents," she said, looking up at Miller. "If Marcus is as meticulous as they say, he won't appreciate being lied to about the collateral." "I'll have the certified copies by tomorrow morning," Miller promised. The phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a social media notification. It was a call from Arthur. She answered on the third ring, her face a mask of professional neutrality. "I hope you're packing your bags, Cassandra," her father's voice boomed, dripping with the false confidence of a man who believed his own lies. He was likely sitting in his leather-bound study, sipping a scotch that cost $500 a bottle, bought with money that didn't belong to him. "I've had the lawyers finalize the new trust. You're officially a guest in my house now. After the gala, I expect you to find your own way. You've always been so proud of that working-class aesthetic of yours. Now you get to live it." "I understand, Arthur," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "Good, don't bother showing up tomorrow. Security has been told you're no longer on the list. It would be an embarrassment for everyone involved if you tried to make a scene in front of Marcus." "I wouldn't dream of making a scene," she said, her gaze drifting to the flash drive on the desk. "I'll see you soon." She hung up before he could respond. The silence returned to the room, heavier than before. She stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the street below. The rain had started to fall, a light drizzle that turned the asphalt into a dark, reflective mirror. She touched the simple Casio on her wrist. The countdown was no longer in heartbeats. It was in hours. 24 hours until the Vance name meant nothing, and the peasant in the off-the-rack suit became the only person in the room with the power to decide who stayed and who went. She wasn't just an auditor anymore. She was the storm they had forgotten to track. The following afternoon, the humidity in the city clung to the skin like a damp shroud, but inside the precinct's side entrance, the air was filtered and clinical. Cassandra Vance stood by the vending machine, her thumb tracing the edge of her simple Casio watch. The digital display ticked toward 3 o'clock. She didn't look like a woman about to dismantle a dynasty. She looked like a tired office clerk waiting for a bus. Detective Miller stepped through the heavy security doors, a thick manila envelope tucked under his arm. He didn't offer a greeting. He simply leaned against the wall beside her, his gaze fixed on the far exit. "The wire transfers from the offshore accounts have been verified," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Your father didn't just skim, Cassandra. He gutted the employee pension fund to pay for Julianna's wedding. It's all here. The forgeries, the shell companies, and the signature that matches Arthur's exactly. She took the envelope, the weight of the paper surprisingly heavy. And the board, have they seen the preliminary report? They'll see it when you decide they see it, Miller replied, finally looking at her. His eyes held a flicker of respect. You're sure about the timing? Once this goes live, there's no walking it back. Your family name will be radioactive. The name was already dead, she said, her voice devoid of emotion. They just haven't smelled the rot yet. 2 hours later, she arrived at the Vance estate. The smell of expensive floor wax and cloying white lilies hit her the moment she stepped into the foyer. It was the final walkthrough for the gala, a choreographed display of wealth that felt increasingly like a funeral. Julianna Vance stood in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by a small army of florists and caterers. She was draped in a cream silk robe that cost more than a mid-sized sedan, her vintage Rolex catching the late afternoon light as she gestured wildly. "The peonies are wilted," Julianna shouted, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "I told you, I want the room to look like a dream, not a clearance sale at a grocery store." She turned, her eyes landing on Cassandra. The frustration on her face curdled into immediate, sharp-edged contempt. "What are you doing here? I thought Dad made it clear you were persona non grata. Security is already on high alert for disturbed individuals." "I came to bring a gift," Cassandra said, walking slowly across the marble floor. The sound of her sensible heels was a dull thud compared to the sharp click of the designer stilettos scattered near the stage. Julianna laughed, a brittle, ugly sound. She walked over, her silk robe rustling like dry leaves. She reached out, flicking the collar of Cassandra's off-the-rack blazer with a manicured nail. "A gift? What could you possibly offer? A coupon for a discount warehouse? Or maybe some advice on how to blend into the wallpaper?" Arthur Vance stepped out from the library, his face reddening the moment he saw his eldest daughter. He adjusted his tailored cufflink, the gold glinting. "Cassandra, I told you to stay away. You're embarrassing yourself. Look at you, you don't belong in this room. You never did." "You're right, Arthur," she said, her calm a stark contrast to his rising heat. "I don't belong in a room built on forgeries and stolen pensions." The room went silent. A florist nearby froze, a bundle of lilies trembling in her hands. Marcus Thorne, who had been quietly reviewing floor plans in the corner, looked up. His eyes narrowed, moving from Arthur's sudden pallor to Cassandra's steady gaze. He was a man who built his empire on data. He knew the sound of a calculated strike when he heard one. "What did you just say?" Arthur hissed, stepping toward her. Cassandra didn't flinch. She reached into her bag and pulled out a single sheet of paper, not the evidence, but a copy of the gala's seating chart. She handed it to Marcus. "I noticed a few names missing from the head table," she said, looking directly at Marcus Thorne. "The forensic auditors from the SEC, for instance. I'm sure they'd love to see the dream the Vances have built." Julianna snatched the paper from Marcus's hand and ripped it in half. "You're insane. You're just a bitter, jealous peasant trying to ruin my moment because nobody will ever look at you the way they look at me." "Enjoy the champagne tonight, Julianna," Cassandra said, turning toward the door. She paused, looking back over her shoulder at the three of them. "Drink the expensive stuff. It's the last vintage you'll ever taste that wasn't paid for by a public defender." She walked out before Arthur could call for security. As she reached her car, the first heavy drops of the storm began to fall, turning the driveway into a dark, reflective mirror. She checked her Casio. 16 hours left. The countdown was no longer in her head. It was in the very air they breathed. She sat in the driver's seat, watching the lights of the mansion flicker through the rain, knowing that by this time tomorrow, the only thing left of the Vance legacy would be the smoke. The evening arrived with a deceptive stillness, the kind that preceded a tectonic shift. Inside the gilded ballroom of the Pier Hotel, the air was thick with the cloying scent of white lilies and the sharp, metallic tang of expensive floor wax. A string quartet played in the corner, their melody nearly drowned out by the rhythmic clinking of crystal and the low, practiced hum of high society chatter. Julianna Vance stood at the center of the room, a vision in hand-stitched ivory silk that shimmered under the massive crystal chandeliers. She held a glass of vintage Krug, her laughter ringing out like silver bells as she leaned into Marcus Thorne. He looked every bit the tech titan in his midnight blue tuxedo, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the room. Beside them, Evelyn and Arthur Vance moved through the crowd with the practiced grace of people who believed they were untouchable, their smiles as bright and hollow as the diamonds around Evelyn's neck. The heavy oak doors at the back of the hall swung open, and the room seemed to lose a few degrees of warmth. Cassandra Vance stepped inside. She hadn't bothered with silk or sequins. She wore the same charcoal gray blazer and tailored trousers she'd worn to the office, her only accessory the black Casio watch strapped to her wrist. To the socialite sipping champagne, she looked like a stray thread on a masterpiece, a caterer who had forgotten her tray. Julianna's eyes found her sister instantly. The influencer's smile didn't falter, but her grip on her champagne flute tightened until her knuckles turned white. She whispered something to Marcus, then detached herself from his side, gliding across the marble floor with the predatory elegance of a swan. "You actually showed up," Julianna said, her voice dropping to a low, venomous hiss as she reached her sister. She didn't look at Cassandra's face. She looked at the scuffed leather of her sensible shoes. "I thought I made it clear that this was a black tie event, not a job interview for a mid-level accounting firm. You look like you're here to audit the hors d'oeuvres." Cassandra didn't flinch. She felt the cool weight of the digital recorder in her pocket and the heavy, rectangular shape of the flash drive tucked into her modest clutch. "I wouldn't miss this for the world, Julianna. It's a night of new beginnings, isn't it?" "It's a night for people who matter," Julianna snapped, her eyes darting around to ensure no one was listening. She leaned in closer, the scent of her jasmine perfume, a bottle that cost more than Cassandra's monthly rent, filling the space between them. "Go stand by the service entrance. If the photographers catch you in the background of my shots, I'll make sure Arthur cuts off your access to the family accounts before the main course is served." "Is that a threat?" Cassandra asked, her voice perfectly level. "It's a promise. You're a blemish on this family, and tomorrow, when I marry Marcus, you'll be a distant, embarrassing memory. Now, get out of my sight. You're depressing the guests." Julianna turned on her heel, her silk train sweeping across the floor with a disdainful hiss. Cassandra watched her go, her gaze shifting to Marcus Thorne, who was watching the exchange from across the room. He didn't look annoyed, he looked curious. "She hasn't changed," a voice rumbled behind her. Cassandra turned to find Arthur Vance standing there. He looked regal, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, but there was a frantic energy behind his eyes that only a forensic auditor would notice. He adjusted his cufflinks, solid gold, engraved with the family crest he had spent 30 years tarnishing. "Father," Cassandra said. "Don't father me," Arthur muttered, his voice tight. "I saw what you were doing at the house yesterday. If you think your little threats carry weight, you're mistaken. I've spent decades building this legacy. I won't let a bitter, pencil-pushing daughter tear it down because she's jealous of her sister's happiness." He stepped closer, invading her personal space. "I've already spoken to the board. Your concerns about the Foundation's ledger have been noted and dismissed as the ramblings of a disgruntled employee. Tomorrow, after the ceremony, you'll receive a severance package and a one-way ticket out of this city. Take it, or I'll ensure you never work in finance again." Cassandra felt a spark of heat in her chest, but she dampened it with the cold reality of the data she had secured. She reached up and adjusted her Casio, the plastic strap a stark contrast to Arthur's gold. "You've always been so focused on the legacy, Arthur, but legacies are built on foundations. Have you checked yours lately? I hear they're prone to collapse." Arthur's face flushed a deep, mottled purple. He opened his mouth to retort, but the chime of a spoon against a crystal glass cut him off. "Ladies and gentlemen," Evelyn Vance announced from the small dais at the front of the room, her voice amplified by the ballroom's perfect acoustics. "If I could have your attention. Before we begin the dinner, my daughter has a special announcement." The crowd shifted, moving toward the long, linen-draped tables. Julianna climbed the steps to the dais, her face glowing with the artificial radiance of a woman who believed she had won. She looked out over the sea of wealth and power, her eyes landing on Cassandra with a smirk that was pure, unadulterated triumph. "Thank you all for being here," Julianna began, her voice projecting the perfect image of a blushing bride-to-be. "Tonight is about more than just a wedding. It's about the union of two families, two legacies. And because I believe in sharing my blessings, Marcus and I have decided to make a very special announcement regarding the Vance Foundation's next major project." She paused for dramatic effect, her hand reaching out for Marcus. He joined her on the stage, his presence commanding the room's absolute silence. Cassandra moved slowly through the crowd, sliding toward the tech booth where a young, nervous-looking assistant was managing the digital presentation. She caught the eye of a man standing near the back of the room, a man in a plain suit who didn't fit in any better than she did. Detective Miller gave her a microscopic nod. "But before we get to that," Julianna continued, her voice dripping with honeyed arrogance, "I want to acknowledge someone who worked very hard to make sure our family's history was preserved. My sister, Cassandra. She's always been so obsessed with the past." A few people chuckled. Julianna's smirk widened. "Cassie, why don't you come up here? I have a little surprise for you. Since you love documents so much, I thought I'd give you the first look at the new foundation charter." Julianna gestured toward the massive projector screen behind her. The room went dark and the screen hummed to life. Cassandra reached the tech booth. She didn't look at the screen. She looked at Julianna's face, memorizing the exact curve of her sister's smile. It was the last time she would ever see it. "Go ahead, Julianna," Cassandra whispered into the darkness, her hand hovering over the input cable. "Tell them everything." Julianna stood center stage, the spotlight catching the hand-stitched silver thread of her gown. She looked every bit the princess she believed herself to be, her chin tilted at that perfect, rehearsed angle for the cameras. "Cassie, don't be shy," she called out, her voice amplified and dripping with a patronizing sweetness that made the skin on Cassandra's neck crawl. "Everyone wants to see the look on your face when you see what I've done for you." The crowd shifted, a sea of silk and tailored wool turning toward the back of the hall. The scent of expensive lilies and floor wax hung heavy in the air, mingling with the faint ozone smell of the cooling fans in the tech booth. Cassandra Vance ignored the heat of the stairs. Her fingers were steady as she tightened the connection on the input cable, the cold plastic clicking into place with a finality only she understood. She could feel the weight of the flash drive in the port, a tiny piece of hardware that held the power to incinerate a 30-year-old dynasty. "Go ahead," Cassandra said, her voice a low murmur that didn't need a microphone to carry the weight of what was coming. Julianna Vance smirked, her thumb pressing the button on the gold-plated remote with a flourish. "Ladies and gentlemen, the future of the Vance legacy." The projector hummed, a beam of brilliant white light cutting through the darkened room to hit the massive screen. But the foundation charter didn't appear. Instead, the screen flickered and settled on a high-resolution scan of a wire transfer. It was dated 3 weeks prior, showing $5 million moving from the Vance estate into an offshore account registered to a shell company in the Cayman Islands. The signature at the bottom, bold and unmistakable, belonged to Julianna. The room didn't just go quiet, it became a vacuum. Julianna's practiced, porcelain smile didn't just fade, it disintegrated. The vibrant rose hue of her cheeks, carefully applied by a stylist, vanished, leaving behind a sickly gray pallor that made her look 10 years older in the harsh glow of the projector. Her eyes, usually wide with performative joy, shrank into frantic, darting pinpricks of terror as they scanned the columns of red numbers. Her jaw didn't just drop, it hung slack, a slight tremor catching the corner of her mouth, while her throat worked in a rhythmic, desperate swallow that produced no sound. The Rolex on her wrist, once a symbol of her untouchable status, seemed to weigh her arm down as it began to shake visibly against the dark fabric of her gown. She looked like a statue caught in the middle of a collapse, the structural integrity of her lies finally giving way under the weight of the truth. A sharp crack echoed through the silence. Arthur Vance had dropped his crystal tumbler. The scent of expensive bourbon splashed across the marble floor, but he didn't look down. He was staring at the screen as the image cycled to the next slide. A side-by-side comparison of his genuine signature and the clumsy forgery he'd used to bypass the estate's primary audit. His face was a mask of ashen shock, his hands fumbling uselessly at his silk tie as if it were suddenly strangling him. "What is this?" Marcus Thorne demanded. The tech billionaire's voice was like a whip crack. He stepped away from Julianna, his eyes moving from the screen to his fiancée with a cold, clinical detachment. He wasn't a man who tolerated being the punchline of a public joke, and the way he folded his arms suggested he was already calculating the cost of the impending legal fallout. It's a mistake," Julianna stammered, her voice thin and reedy. She looked toward the tech booth, her desperation finally breaking through the mask. "Cassandra, turn it off. What are you doing?" Cassandra stepped out from behind the console and into the light. She didn't rush. She didn't shout. She simply walked down the center aisle, her off-the-rack blazer a stark contrast to the opulence around her. Every head turned. The whispers started then, a rising tide of "Is that true?" And did she really steal it? From the socialites who had been laughing at Julianna's jokes only moments before. "You said I was obsessed with documents, Julianna," Cassandra said, her voice echoing clearly through the hall. She stopped 10 feet from the stage, looking up at the sister who had spent a lifetime trying to bury her. "I thought you'd appreciate these. They're the only things in this room that aren't a lie." Julianna lunged toward the edge of the stage, her fingers clawing at the air as if she could pull the images off the screen. "You're jealous. You're a bitter, pathetic auditor who couldn't handle my success." "I'm the auditor who just found the hole in your boat," Cassandra replied, her tone as flat and cold as a winter morning. She turned her back on the stage, catching the eye of Detective Miller, who was already moving toward Arthur with a pair of silver handcuffs glinting under the chandeliers. Cassandra didn't wait for the security guards to arrive or for the inevitable screaming to start. She walked toward the grand mahogany doors, the sound of her sensible heels steady and rhythmic against the marble. She had given them exactly what they asked for, a surprise they would never forget. The doors swung open, and she stepped out into the cool night air, leaving the wreckage of the Vance name behind her. But as she reached her car, a familiar black sedan pulled up to the curb, and the window rolled down. The window of the black sedan slid down with a mechanical whisper, revealing the sharp, unyielding profile of Marcus Thorne. He sat in the shadows of the plush interior, the dim glow of his smartphone illuminating a face that remained unreadable even as the world behind Cassandra Vance erupted into a symphony of sirens and panicked shouts. He didn't look at the gala. He looked only at her, his gaze lingering on the simple Casio watch on her wrist before meeting her eyes. "It's done, then?" he asked. His voice was a low, steady vibration that seemed to anchor the swirling chaos of the night. Cassandra nodded, her fingers tracing the cold line of the car's doorframe. "The forensic trail is complete. Detective Miller has the original ledgers and the offshore routing numbers. There's nowhere left for them to run." Marcus Thorne reached out, his hand hovering near the door handle as if to offer her a seat in his sanctuary, but he paused. His attention shifted to the grand entrance of the estate. Julianna Vance had just burst through the mahogany doors, her frantic silhouette framed by the warm, mocking glow of the chandeliers inside. Julianna didn't see the police cars yet. She didn't see her father, Arthur Vance, being guided toward a dark sedan by men in windbreakers. Her eyes were locked on the black car at the curb, and the moment she spotted Marcus, she broke into a desperate, lopsided run. One of her designer heels had snapped on the marble stairs, forcing her into a panicked, limping gait that stripped away every ounce of the quiet luxury she had spent a lifetime cultivating. "Marcus," she shrieked, her voice piercing the damp night air. She reached the car, her hands slamming against the hood, leaving smudges on the pristine wax. "Marcus, you have to stop them. Cassandra is insane. She's fabricated everything because she's bitter. She's trying to destroy our family out of pure, pathetic spite." Marcus Thorne didn't move. He didn't even blink. He simply rolled the window down further, allowing the full weight of his disappointment to settle on the woman he had intended to marry. Julianna Vance's face didn't just fall. It seemed to dissolve in real time. The carefully applied porcelain foundation couldn't hide the gray, sickly pallor that swept across her skin as she realized Marcus wasn't looking at her with concern, but with a clinical, detached disgust. Her eyes, usually narrowed with calculated vanity, stretched wide until the whites showed all around the irises, flickering with a primal, cornered terror. Her mouth hung open, the lower lip trembling so violently that she looked less like a socialite and more like a ghost. The arrogant tilt of her chin, which had looked down on Cassandra for years, collapsed into a hollow, sunken ruin. She looked at Cassandra, then back at Marcus, her breathing coming in shallow, ragged hitches that sounded like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "The merger is dead, Julianna," Marcus said, his voice devoid of any heat. "And so is the engagement. I don't do business with thieves, and I certainly don't marry them." "I didn't know," Julianna sobbed, her hands sliding off the car as her knees began to buckle. "My father, he handled the accounts. I'm just the face of the brand." "You were the beneficiary of the theft," Cassandra intercepted, her voice flat and cold as a winter morning. She stepped closer to her sister, the scent of expensive lilies from the gala's floral arrangements clashing with the smell of rain-slicked asphalt. "Every designer bag, every exclusive trip, every bit of influence you sold to your followers was paid for by the pension funds of the people who worked for our father. You didn't just know, Julianna. You asked for more." A few feet away, Detective Miller slammed the door of the squad car, the metallic thud echoing like a gavel. Arthur Vance was gone, whisked away into the night to face a reality no amount of silk could soften. The witnesses, the elite of the city who had spent the evening whispering about Cassandra's peasant attire, were now standing on the portico, their phones out, recording the fall of the Vance dynasty. They weren't offering help. They were documenting a scandal, their faces twisted with the predatory glee of those who had found a new topic for tomorrow's brunch. Julianna looked at the crowd, then at the broken heel in her hand. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The social circle she had killed her soul to maintain was already closing its ranks against her. "What am I supposed to do?" Julianna whispered, looking at Cassandra with a sudden, horrifying vulnerability. "I have nothing. You've taken everything." "I didn't take anything that was yours," Cassandra replied. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, laminated card, her official credentials as a senior auditor for the federal task force. She let Julianna look at it, let her see the authority that had been hidden in plain sight behind the off-the-rack blazers and the modest watch. "I just returned what you stole. The penthouse is being seized at midnight. I'd suggest you find a pair of shoes that actually fit. You have a long walk ahead of you." Cassandra didn't wait for the tears to start again. She didn't stay to watch the security guards begin the process of clearing the estate. She turned her back on the wreckage of her family name and stepped toward the waiting sedan. Marcus Thorne opened the door for her, a gesture of respect he had never once shown Julianna. As the car pulled away, Cassandra looked out the rear window. Julianna was a small, shivering blot of white silk against the dark gravel, surrounded by the flashing blue and red lights of a world that no longer belonged to her. Cassandra turned forward, the weight of the last 5 years finally lifting from her shoulders, leaving behind a cold, quiet peace. "Where to?" Marcus asked. "Away from here," Cassandra said, her voice steady. "I have a lot of work to do tomorrow." 6 months had passed since the flashing blue lights of the police cruisers faded into the distance behind Cassandra Vance's retreating car. The transition from the chaos of that night to the sterile, quiet luxury of her new life had been as sharp as a surgical incision. Now, she stood in a corner office on the 42nd floor, the floor-to-ceiling glass offering a panoramic view of a city that finally felt like it belonged to her. The air in the room smelled of expensive espresso and the faint, crisp scent of high-end stationery, the perfume of real power, not the performative kind. She checked the time on her simple Casio watch. The plastic strap was a stark contrast to the tailored charcoal suit she wore, but she refused to part with it. It was a reminder of the woman who had sat in the shadows, counting every penny and every lie until the numbers finally added up to justice. A soft knock at the door preceded Marcus Thorne. He didn't wait for an invitation, stepping into the room with a measured stride. He looked different than he had during his engagement to her sister. The tension that had once tightened his jaw was gone, replaced by a professional curiosity. He leaned against the edge of her mahogany desk, tossing a thin manila folder onto the surface. "The final sentencing came through this morning," he said, his voice low and resonant. "Arthur Vance received 10 years, no possibility of early release given the scale of the forgery. Detective Miller said the evidence you provided was so airtight the defense didn't even try to bargain." Cassandra didn't pick up the folder. She didn't need to. She had memorized every transaction, every forged signature, and every shell company her father had created. And the restitution. "Every cent recovered from the offshore accounts has been redirected to the victim's fund," Marcus replied. He paused, his eyes searching hers. "Including the remaining equity from the penthouse. It's over, Cassandra. The Vance name has been scrubbed clean, even if the person who wore it is behind bars." "It wasn't about the name," she whispered, turning back to the window. "It was about the truth." "I know," he said. He stood straight, adjusting his cuffs. "I'm heading to the gala tonight. The board is expecting the new majority shareholder to make an appearance. Will you be there?" "Not tonight," she said. "I have a few things to finish here." After he left, the silence of the office felt heavier. She grabbed her coat and descended to the street level, bypassing the waiting car she now kept on retainer. She needed to feel the pavement beneath her feet. The autumn air was biting, smelling of damp leaves and exhaust, a visceral reminder of the world outside her glass tower. She walked 3 blocks before she saw her. Julianna Vance was standing outside a small, cramped bakery, her back to the street. The custom-tailored silks and vintage Rolexes were gone, replaced by a pilled wool coat that looked 2 sizes too big and a pair of scuffed, sensible shoes. She was holding a heavy plastic crate of flour, her shoulders slumped under the weight. The lifestyle influencer, who had once demanded the world bow to her whims, was now just another face in the crowd, struggling to make a shift change. Cassandra stopped 10 feet away. The power inversion was absolute. She could have walked over, could have dropped a comment about the quality of the flour or the state of Julianna's manicure, but the urge wasn't there. The rage that had fueled her for 5 years had burned out, leaving only a cold, hollow space where her family used to be. Julianna turned, wiping a streak of white powder from her forehead. Her eyes met Cassandra's. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. There was no shouting, no entitled demands, no gaslighting. There was only the raw, jagged realization of a woman who had lost everything she thought defined her. Julianna's lip trembled, her gaze falling to Cassandra's polished leather boots before she quickly looked away, retreating back into the shadows of the bakery's kitchen. Cassandra watched the door swing shut. This was the face slap she had envisioned, the silent acknowledgement that the underdog had not only won, but had moved so far beyond the bully that they were no longer even in the same orbit. She continued her walk, eventually reaching a small park. She sat on a bench and pulled a faded photograph from her wallet. It was a picture of 2 little girls sitting on a tire swing, laughing, their arms linked. It was a relic of a time before greed and vanity had rotted the foundation of their home. She had won. She had the wealth, the respect, and the justice she had craved. But as the sun began to set, casting long, orange shadows across the grass, Cassandra realized the true cost of her victory. She had dismantled the lies, but in doing so, she had been forced to burn the bridge back to the only family she had ever known. She was the mistress of all she surveyed, but she was surveying it alone. She tucked the photo away and stood up, the cold wind whipping at her coat. She had a lot of work to do tomorrow, and for the first time in her life, the only person she had to answer to was herself. The peace was quiet, and it was earned, but it was the heaviest thing she had ever carried.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.